Tav Kufyud Beis Summit Beis, the second line from the top. We were in the middle of the discussion that we proved that Rav Yochanan apparently paskined like Rav Yehuda, that said by a sandal, if the outer strap is broken, it's not considered a kli anymore, and therefore l'gabe tuma it'll be tor, l'gabe Shabbos it'll be muksa. That sandal has a strap, and it has a strap that's on the outside, and it has a strap that's on the inside. If the outside strap is torn, it's broken, generally speaking, a person won't mend it because it looks unsightly. So therefore, if it's torn, therefore it's not considered a kli anymore, and it's considered tor, and it's considered muksa. Now, the Gemara asks that you should be able to switch it around if you have a shoe or a sandal that has a strap on the outside. Well, if it's torn and now you tie it, you can switch this from for instance, the right foot to the left foot, and if the knot therefore is in between the two, it's on the inside, that knot will now be on the inside. If the knot is on the outside, then if you switch it around and switch it to the other side, then it becomes in the inside. And therefore, we should say in such a case that it should still be a kli. But we said that Rav Yochanan passed like Rav Yehuda, and that we see Rav Yehuda holds that we don't say that it's still usable because he can switch it around to the other foot. We don't say a person would do that, would be likely to do that. And therefore, if it's torn on the outside, on the chitzaina, it's torn. More, is that correct? Is it so that Rav Yochanan said, halach is like Rav Yehuda, v'amar Rabbi Yochanan halach is tam mishnah. We know Rav Yochanan as a principle, he says, halach is tam mishnah. Utanana, we learned in the Mishnah, tam mishnah, sandal shenivska achas me'oznav. If one of the flaps of the sandal was broken, v'tikna tami medras. If one of them was broken, it's still tami medras. If azova, ayeletus, and nida, things that they sit on, that their weight rests on, shoes, sandalim, and they're tami medras. They're tami medras, and those things are avatuma. So a zav or a zava wearing a sandal, that sandal would be, tami medras would be an avatuma. What they come into contact with would be a rishon, but they're an avatuma. Now, if it broke, just because one of the flaps broke, it's still considered a kli. It's not mevatal from the tuma, and it's still tami. So if it's nifscha achas, if it's only one of them that are torn, it's still tami. My love, lo yishna pnimis lo yishna chitzaina. Doesn't that imply that there's no difference which one? And even if it's the outside one, it's still considered a kli. It's still considered a mana. So you see that we do say that it's still usable because a person could switch it from one foot, the left foot to the right, or the right to the left, and the chitzaina could become a pnimis, which is not like Rav Yehuda. And this is Stam Mishnah, and Rav Yochanan passed like a Stam Mishnah. Gemara says, Loi pnimis davka. It means when it says one of them, it means the inner one. It doesn't mean the outer one. We're not referring to the outer one. Frag the Gemara, chitzaina, my Torah. Do you mean to say, but if it would be the outer one, it taka would be tor? If that's so, the tanin nifseka shniya, the Mishnah continues and says, if the second flap tore, vitikna, if the second flap tore, and it was masakin it tore mina medris, it's no longer tumas medris. Meaning, the first strap it tore, he was masakin it, he fixed it. And then the second flap tore, there's no longer tumas medras. Aval tame maga medras. But it's tame maga medras. As Rashi explains, the first flap tore, he was a masakin. So it's a kli. Now the second one tore, well, it's still considered a usable kli. It's not considered something which is a broken kli because the first flap has already been masakin. And so therefore only one flap now has been torn. And even that flap could be mended. But it's not Tame Medris because even if he is masakin the second flap, it's considered a new minol. It's panim chadoshes ba'olakan. It's not the same minol that the zav was using, that the zav wore, that he was resting on. So it's not the same medrash. If the second flap tore, it's not that it's not a kli anymore. It is still a kli. It's a usable kli, and in fact, it could be mended, and mikan lahaba, it could be mikabel tumas medrash. But it's the original tumas medrash that was there from before when the zav was wearing it. That's gone because even if he is misakin it, it's a new minol. It's not the same minol. It's pan chadoshes ba'olakan, but it's tomi maga medrash because it's still a kli. And when it was a medrash, the kli touched itself. So a minol, a sandal, which is a medrash, is an avatuma. But even if the tumas medrash goes off, it's still a rishon tuma because it came into contact with itself, so to speak. In itself was a kli that was in contact with a medrash, with an avatuma. So now, even though the minol is no longer the original minol and it's no longer Tami Medrash, but it is a Rishon Latuma, it's Tami Maga Medrash. But I'll call upon him, if that's the case, if you're making a chiluk, if you're saying this Mishnah is like Rav Yehuda and you're making a chiluk and you're saying that when it says that the nifsika, the first one tore, it's only if it's on the inside, but if it would be on the outside, it would be tohar, even though it's only one strap. So if that's the case, why does the Seifa have to come to a new case and say the second flap tore, niflik v'nisna b'didah? You can even stay with the same case, that it's only one flap, and say, when do we say that it's tomei, that it's still considered a minol? That's only when the inner flap tore. But if it's the outside one, then it would be tohor. We have to say al korchach. We have to say tei mishnoseinu besandal sheish lo arba oznaim v'arba tarsiyosim. We have to al korchach b'doichik say that the Mishnah is talking where there are four flaps. There's two on the outside. There's two on the inside. So when it talks about the first one and when it talks about the second one, in both cases we're talking about the outside flaps. So when it says that the one of them tore, and it's still Tommy, that's because there's a second flap. The second one tore, and then it is Tohar, because that means that both outside flaps were torn. And it's like Rav Yehuda, where we don't say he can switch it around from one foot to the next. So Al-Korach, we have to say, is talking about when there's two outside flaps, and we're talking about one, and then the second, both of them are referring to the outside, not to the inside. And in Korach, we have to say that Shaloi Lishbar Dvarav Shel Rav Yochanan, not to have a contradiction. Rav Yochanan, because Rav Yochanan said that the halacha is like Rav Yehuda, and here it's a Stam Mishnah that would appear to be not like Rav Yehuda, but B'deichik, we're saying the Sekimta so that it could come out according to Rav Yehuda. He also Rav and Amar of Hanan Barava Amar Rav Halacha Rav Yehuda. He said that the halacha is like Rav Yehuda, but Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ein Halacha Rav Yehuda. And here he says Rabbi Yochanan says the halacha is not like Rav Yehuda. Frankly, Gemara mi Amar Rav Yochanan Hachi, is that so? V'amet to become midametaris Rav Yochanan libid Rav Yehuda. Since we saw before in the previous Omen that Rav Yochanan was metaritz according to Rav Yehuda, the Mishnah according to Rav Yehuda. He's that Saran according to Rav Yehuda, Shema Minak Rav Yehuda Sfir Lei. That shows that he holds like Rav Yehuda. When it says Amaroy Ninu, Algalibid Rav Yochanan, there's two versions. Amaroim argue what Rav Yochanan held. Did he hold halachos like Rav Yehuda or not? So now also, we learned in the Mishnah, Kol Kli Balibatim Shirin Kirimayim. The shear of a Kli of Balibatim, the ones who don't use it they're not tradesmen, they don't sell it, that's for their personal use, they're kelim that are used for the personal use. Kli balabatim shiur makirimayim. That even if it has a small hole, and even has a whole kazayas, it's still considered usable. If it has a small hole, they'll use it for items which are larger. But once it has a hole the size of a rima in a pomegranate, then already that hole is considered too big. It's considered now a shever kli. The kli is considered to be broken. It's not tomei, it's tohor. If there was tuma, it departed, and it's not makabel tuma. Once it has a hole the size of a rima in a pomegranate, it's not usable anymore, and it's tohor. That's the shear of kelim that people use for the personal use. So boy, nikiv k'meitzi zayis. Let's say the hole is smaller. It's only the size of an olive, a zayis. V'sasman, then he sealed it up. V'chazven nikve k'meitzi zayis, and then next to it there was another hole, the size also only v'zayis. V'sasman, and he sealed that up. Now, if you take the sum total of all the holes, it would be the size of a riman, of a pomegranate. But in the meantime, you only have a small hole. Each small hole was sealed up, and one next to the other. And now there's only a small hole the size of a zayis. Now you have, in sum total, you have holes that were there, and the sum total of all those holes would be the size of a remine. But right now they're sealed up. Do we say, well, right now you don't have a hole the size of a remine? Or do you say, but you had holes in total that when you add them up all together were the size of a remine? Ma, what's the din? Amar lei Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan says, Rebbe, Shanis lanu, you just taught us the mission that we just brought down before by the sandal. Sandal shenivska achas me'ozna v'tikna tomei. If one of the flaps were torn, it's tomei. So it's tomei medras. Nifska shniya v'tikna, if the second one tore and he was socking it prior to it being torn, the first flap was bended. Now the second flap tore mina medras, it's not tomei medras, it's no longer tar mina medras, well tomei maga medras, but it's tomei maga medras. V'amrin alon, and we asked you, Ma'ishno Rishayna, the Hakaim Shniya Nami Misakna Rishayna. So we asked the question, what's the difference of the first and the second flap? The first flap, if it's torn, it's still Tomei Medras. Why is it still Tomei Medras? Because the second flap is intact. Well, if after the first flap tore he was misaking it, then the second flap tore, what's the difference? Now, the second flap tore, but the first flap is already repaired, it's mended. So if the first flap tears, you say it's tomei because you still have the second flap. Fine. But if the second flap tears, why do you say tore? You have the first flap because it's already been mended. And so what was the answer? What's the explanation? Is yes, you have the first flap, but now the first flap was torn and mended. Now the second flap tore, so you have now, it's not the same minol, it's not the same sandal that was mekabel the tumas medras that the zav rested on, because panim chadosh is ba'olikan, it's considered something new. So the tumas medras that was there, that was as a result of the zav wearing this shoe, that's gone, that departed, because that minol is no longer here. This is panim chadosh, it's considered a new minol. This kli in our case as well, it's the same thing. Yes, right now it's all sealed up, the small holes are all sealed up, but it's considered a new kli. It's not considered the same kli that was there beforehand that was tomei, that was makabel tuma. Because it has now all of these holes, the sum total is a remine, even though they're sealed now, this is considered panim chadashis. It's considered something new. It's not the same kli that came into contact with the tuma that was makabel tuma. He said about him, Rebbe said about Rav Yochanan, less than by Inish. It's not a person, it's like a malach. So impressed with this explanation, he said, he's like a malach. Or another version is, this is a person. Das is a mensch. This is a person. Meaning, this is a person, the way a person is supposed to be. Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rav Bar Zimuna, Im Rishayim b'nei Malachim. If the Frierdiker Adairs, the people were considered to be b'nei Malachim, like children of Malachim, they were on that madrigal, they were considered Malachim, Anu b'nei Anashim. We are in a lower madrigal. There's a Yeridus Adairs. We are on a lower level. We're only considered the sons of people were considered human. If the first generation, the early generation, were considered to be human, we're only like donkeys. But not even like the donkeys of the great tzaddikim of Chanina ben Doisa, Shal Pinchas ben Yoyer, Chanina ben Doisa, that the chamor would not eat from the produce that was tevel, that meiser was not removed from it. Or Pinchas ben Yoyer, there's two versions. One, Rashi brings down that he brought back payment to Pinchas ben Yoyer. If the payment was not correct, he wouldn't move. And one time there was a pair of shoes left on him, and he wouldn't move. Another version brought down by other Rishonim is a similar type of a ma'isa, that he went 3 days without eating because it was tevel, it was not ma'usa. But so then, if they are like b'nei anoshim, we are like chamorim, but not like these type of chamorim. El kashar chamorim, like regular donkeys. So the Mishnah said, "Night is yain shel shemen." You can tie and untie the knots of jugs of wine and oil. So pshita, well, of course, it's not a kesher kayam. It's made to be constantly tied and untied. Gemara says, it has 2 flaps. You might think he doesn't tie and untie both of them, that one is permanent. He can remove the contents by only untying the other one, the second one. So you might think that one of them is permanent. We don't know which one, so you can't tie and untie because one of them is a kesher kayama kamash malan, that he won't do it that way. He'll tie and untie both of them, and therefore neither of them are considered a kesher kayama, so you can untie and untie both. Similarly, Dirshu boser. So it said in the Mishnah that if you have a pot of meat and you have on a covering that's covered over it, or that's covered with it, you can untie and untie it. So pshita, of course, same idea, that it's not a kesher kayama, it's constantly tied and untied. Light shrich, the Gemara says the islay shloch, it has a spout. You might think he's going to remove the contents from the spout, and therefore, and the kesher that he ties for the covering of the pot will be kesher kayama, and therefore it's also to tie and untie on Shabbos. Kamash malan. Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov says if you have ropes that you tie in front of a doorway to restrain an animal, to make sure that it doesn't go out, again, it's tied and untied regularly. It's not a kesher kayama, it's mutter to do it on Shabbos. So, if more pshit, of course, is mutter to tie and untie it. It's not a kesher kayama. It has 2 ropes. So Rashi has 2 pshatim. One is that there's one on top of the other, or one that it's a rope that's tied on 2 sides of the doorway. You might think that, well, the animal can come in and out b'doichik if only one is tied and one is untied, and so maybe one he'll leave there permanently, and the other one he'll just tie and untie the other one, and the animal can go in and out b'doichik, but he doesn't have to bother tying and untying both. So you might think that one of them is permanent, and therefore it would be a kesher kayama kamash malan. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda Mashmuel Alocha Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. He said the halacha is Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. Amar Lebai Alocha Mekal de Pligi. You're saying the halacha is like him, which implies there's a machlekes, and we paskin like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. But there's no machlekes over here. Just like in all of the cases, we say it's mutter. This should be the same thing. Amar Le my nafkalach mina. He says, so what's the difference? Then certainly that lamaisa, this is the halacha. If there's no machlekes, then certainly this is the halacha. Like Gemara, we're learning Gemara's Gemara today. It should be like a song without any meaning. If you're making a statement, it has to have meaning to it.